Chapter 5. The Evils. My last name is Zhang, I'm Zhang Chengeling. The young boy sat down, face dark, but even when his clothes were in tatters, the colors made it clear that they were made from expensive materials, and not something a commoner would wear. Joe. He stopped, unsure how to address this beggar-looking man. Just call me uncle. Joe's issue replied blatantly. Zhang Chengeling tried to smile but didn't really succeed. He lowered his head, looking at the ground inside the shrine that was covered in dust and overgrown with grass, still in a state of shock. The great tragedy came in a blink of an eye without knowledge, and his mind had yet to catch up to what happened. Guxiang whispered, Zhang Chengeling? Sounds kind of familiar. Zhou's issue asked, is your father Sir Zhang, Lord of Nami Holdings? Guxiang blurted out in surprise, you're Zhang Yusin's son? Doubt, and how on earth does Zhang Yusin have such a useless offspring like this? One was evidently written on her face. Zhang Chengeling must have seen it too, as his head dropped even lower, hands balled into fists by his side. Zhou's issue had to swiftly interrupted Guxiang's spirit-crushing session. Having realized earlier that this girl would just say whatever people hated hearing, he coughed, I hadn't known, my apologies. Guxiang started bombarding him with questions. Your father has quite a reputation, huh? A few days ago when we arrived here, we got to hear about his glory days back when he was younger, and that the family and business recently have been doing really well. People said after getting successful he's settled here and half detached himself from society, never engaging in any affairs. The holdings were also said to house guests who are pretty decent at martial arts, so no one dared stir up troubles. Who would hunt you down when you have a father like that? Her voice carried a flippant attitude since the whole problem didn't concern her in the slightest. The old woman clearly felt indignant as she stood up. My lord is the best well-doer you can find, the most honorable, kind-hearted and generous. He will always help people even when he has no idea who they are. Guxiang only scoffed, tone enigmatic, all right auntie, we know how good of a father this little one has already. But does this honorable, generous father stop you too from being chased down at late night? Zhang Yusin had only reached 50 not long ago, and it was not an exaggeration to deem him someone of virtue and prestige. He had not been doing a lot of Zhonghu business ever since he started building a family for himself, but if there was ever a grand event, it'd still be obligatory to send him an invitation. Zhou's issue felt the dead should at least deserve some respect, and while the girl's attitude might be unintentional, it was still ill-mannered of her to have said those things. He cut in, just now, who was that person trying to kill you? Zhang Chengeling went silent for a bit, then spoke under his breath, he's Shui-Fang the hanged ghost. What did you say? What did you say? Zhou's issue and Guxiang both exclaimed. The former was frowning, and on the latter's face was quaint surprise. Zhang Chengeling repeated with emphasis on every word, it's Shui-Fang the hanged ghost, I heard someone calling him that with my own ears. He took a deep breath suddenly, as if remembering and realizing something, the blood that night, the smoke and fire, the screaming, they all came back to him at once. He stood up shakily, face pale, whole body twitching, not uttering a single word. Guxiang jerked, pointing at him, is he having a seizure? Zhou's issue's face was solemn. He got to the boy, brushing over the acupuncture point that would help him pass out. When Zhang Chengeling turned soft and unconscious in his arms, he carefully laid him down. He sighed, his mind shut down from the memory onslaught. Just let him rest for a while first. He turned to the panicked woman, is someone plotting against the Zhang family, and? Seeing Zhang Chengeling in that state, she lost all will. After many tears and snot, she finally recounted the exact events. At midnight, the backyard suddenly caught fire. Then came the men in black who appeared out of nowhere, looking like hordes of demons dropping from the sky. The most terrifying thing was that all the guests, those masters who could detect everything from the flick of the grass, were unable to fight back and left without anyone knowing. There was only eccentric old Li left. He arrived at Suzhou 5 years ago, always protecting the Sangs from afar, refusing to enter the holdings. He reasoned that to be able to have the Zhang's food, you had to be a guest. He was simply someone who came to pay a debt. It was that eccentricity that had helped save the Zhang bloodline, though just barely. After a while, Zhou's issue sighed. Old brother Li was a special man among us. He turned to the woman in tears again. She was only a servant, unable to understand everything. Do you have any relatives? She nodded, I have a nephew living down south. Zhou's issue gave her a gold ingot. Take this and go. You've been showing your utmost loyalty by following the Zhang's young master here. Don't let yourself suffer further at your old age. She took the money, biting it by instinct, then smiling in embarrassment once she realized what she did. The tears had stopped, And she told him softly, "Yes, this one is too old now, just gonna a burden for young master." Practically, staying at a place where a dead body was buried and grass grew everywhere was not really a good idea either, so she left immediately. Zither thought that she was just a servant, so it was unlikely that she would be chased after. She showed her gratitude and walked away while he watched her expressionlessly. It was midnight, so Zither knew the prickling pain in his chest right now was the nails acting up. It was not the kind of pain that mangle your body, or the slow, simmering kind as seen with internal injuries, but one that felt like someone was cutting his meridians apart one by one. Fortunately, after more than a year of suffering he had well adapted to the pain. Nothing showed on his face. He also was still wearing a mask, making it harder for Guxiang to see his real expressions. Zither tried to divert his attention by thinking about the girl's ignorance while discussing Zhang Yusen, asking her, "Is the one with you at the tavern not here today?" Guxiang startled, "How do you know he's with me?" Then nodded, "Right, you heard us talking, didn't you? That's why back when I asked you the question, you answered exactly like my master." She pursed her lips, showing disdain at his cheating act. Zither smiled, "Yes, is your master here right now?" Guxiang sat on the incense table with her legs swinging, not touching the ground. She tilted her head, eyes casting downwards, appearing completely innocent. Then she shrugged, "He went to see his old lover." Zither stared at her doubtfully. She was very pretty, so he had though she was one of the man's concubines. Guxiang wrinkled her nose, glaring at him, "Why do you look at me like that? Do you want me to guard outside his window and hear him doing it with another man?" Zither coughed in faint embarrassment, rubbing his nose, "Young miss." Guxiang looked like a small animal baring its sharp teeth at him. She then turned her head away in thoughts, poking the still asleep Zhang Chengeling with the tip of her toes. "Do you believe him? That the man in black was the hanged ghost?" Zither hesitated. He must have meant the hanged ghost from the ghosts of Quanju Ridge. Brief mockery colored Guxiang's gaze, "You truly know a lot. How many hanged ghosts do you think there are in this world, really?" Zither shook his head. He was about to reply when the pain on his chest attacked, so he had to pretend to be pondering carefully. He said after a while, "Legend has it that in Quanju Ridge of Mount Fengya there is a place called the Ghost Valley. In recent years, people guilty of horrible crimes in Zhonghu and have nowhere else to go have been seeking protection there. But once they enter the valley, their humanity will be lost, all mortal grudges wiped from their mind. Surviving in the valley is no easy feat either, as one will end up near dead. All in all, the stories are pretty terrifying, so their enemies never speak of them. I heard that Shui Fang the hanged ghost used to be an infamous flower thief with a body count of 26 young people, both males and females, including the closed disciple of Imei sex leader. He was chased after by the 6 main sects and had no choice but hide in the Ghost Valley of Quanju." Guxiang blinked, "Then do you think he's that disgusting Shui Fang?" Zither laughed. "Shui Fang has made a name for himself for 30 years, he's the evil of evils. How can he be easily defeated by a young one like you?" Guxiang's anger was about to flare, but after thinking it over, she came to agree with him, nodding, "True, if it was really the hanged ghost that I killed then my ancestors are gonna claw out of their graves, but I have no parents, no idea where the family graves are, so they probably won't be able to come out. Which means that man is definitely not hanged ghost, right?" Zither saw no correlations between people resurrecting and the hanged ghost, but seeing the girl deeply pleased with her reasoning, he didn't have the heart to break it to her. The immense pain still persisted, so he went silent, leaning on one side to rest until morning. The nails would always raise hell after midnight, so he made sure to sleep early to gather enough strength when the torment hit. But his schedule was broken today and he was unable to go back to sleep. All he could do now was gritting his teeth and bearing it. The agony only subsided at the peak of sunrise from the east, but by then he felt like he was almost paralyzed. He attempted to tune his breathing, but suddenly Guxiang, who was leaning on the Buddha's altar dozing off, woke with a start, pretty eyes scanning around. "Someone's here," she announced urgently. Zither frowned. He could hear it too. He wanted to stand but only staggered back down. Under Guxiang's look of surprise, he slowly supported himself up by grasping at the table, lowering his voice, "Just numb legs from sitting too long." Guxiang's disbelief only deepened with the flimsy excuse. Morning was when Zither was at his weakest, and the quick mediation earlier didn't help much. But he didn't want to fight someone right now either. Get the boy and hide. "Hide? Hide where?" Guxiang looked at him with her big eyes. Zither was temporarily helpless. They didn't get to do anything else as a group of well-trained people with their faces covered barged in through the window, glancing at a sleeping Zhang Chengeling and charging forwards. Zhou Zishu, still leaned on the table, saw one with their sword aiming their attack at the young boy. No one saw what happened, as there was only a fleeting shadow, but then skinny fingers, in the same state of emaciation as the mask on Zhou Zishu's face, were already around the person's throat. There wasn't even time to cry out before they spasmed and stopped breathing. The cruel method got the attention of the rest of the group. They had no choice but to halt and take precautions against this sickly-looking man who seemed like he couldn't even stand straight. Gu Xiang secretly stuck her tongue out, jumping down from the incense table to stand behind Zhou Zishu. He knew at first glance that those people only dressed to intimidate. They couldn't be expendable assassins with all this cautiousness. Had it been Tian, they would have never hesitated to put the mission first, even when their friends or their own life was on the line. They were definitely not those infamous ghosts either. The ghost could never be this coordinated. Seemed like the Zhang family was specifically targeted. He leisurely fixed his sleeves as if the rags he was wearing were his old robes hemmed with silver thread. Halfway through, feeling ridiculous himself, he stopped with a smile. It's way too early to be attacking a defenseless child, isn't it? The least you can do first is say hi. Chapter 6. The Beauty. No one made a sound. The group quickly exchanged looks, disregarding Zhang Chengling to slowly circle around Gu Xiang and Zhou Zishu. Gu Xiang sighed. What an unfortunate situation. I haven't done good deeds in forever, and of course the moment I did it, troubles came to me. Brother Zhou, I'm just a frail maiden who has never been attacked by this many before. I'm very afraid, please protect me. That last sentence could really scare people to death. Zhou Zishu almost had to struggle to breathe properly, giving Gu Xiang a bothered look while the girl put on her best poker face. She then stared back at him witheringly. The group of assassins felt somewhat out of place during this lovingly tender staring contest. It wasn't clear who issued the order for others to move forward, but in no time, a web-like formation was created, caging the two inside. Only now did Gu Xiang utter a soft ah, face stern, interest peaked. The delicate charade was dropped. She ignored Zhou Zishu, pulling out a small dagger, ready to face the oncoming assault. She had faith in her own capability, but quickly realized the formation was quite a tough one the moment the fight started. There were 14 enemies, and while it was possible that not all of them would be a match for her, as a whole they had created continuous pressure on all sides, making the situation increasingly perilous. She ended up forced to retreat while fighting, with the formation simultaneously closing in on her, blocking all escapes. Doubt festered in Gu Xiang as she withdrew next to Zhou Zishu. They stood with their back toward each other. Zhou Zishu's gaze darkened. He watched their enemies without blinking, telling Gu Xiang, I've underestimated them. Gu Xiang couldn't take it in at first. Her forehead sweated faintly. What? Is this formation? Zhou Zishu replied, I've never encountered it before, but it's said that there exists one called the formation of far and wide. Its structure is ever-changing and well-coordinated. Every person's gap can be filled in by others almost immediately and immaculately, creating a barrier through which nothing can pierce. Gu Xiang cried out as Zhou Zishu used his bare hand to stop an incoming blade and knocked it away. Then what do we do now? Zhou Zishu gave her no answer, eyes entirely focused. All of a sudden, he flew up, using the altar as a platform to launch himself further into the air. The dusty table didn't even budge during the whole process. 3 masked men followed him immediately, swords blocking every way out, but Zhou Zishu unexpectedly moved backwards, wriggling through their defense like a fish to reach the Buddha statue. He made a noise, and with an unknown strength, using his hands to propel the statue forward, mumbling, Buddha, have mercy and help me this time. The stone statue came at the masked men at full force. Gu Xiang immediately stooped down to get out of its way, feeling the wind grazing her hair. The 3 after Zhou Zishu in midair were not that fast. They didn't expect this retaliation at all. Facing it head-on was the only option since there was no way to dodge or seek assistance, and naturally they were knocked back, creating a gaping hole in the formation. Gu Xiang snickered, interesting. She didn't let this momentum go to waste, and with a wave of the arm, an arrow shot out from inside her sleeve. The one directly facing her had to bear the brunt of the attack with their face, and they fell back without a sound. The remained lost all their courage. Gu Xiang's murderous streak made its appearance again, and she started charging at them without a care. Zhou Zishu had exhausted all his strength with that move, his yet-to-recover limbs now temporarily numb. He sat calmly on the incense table with no further desire to boast his might. Gu Xiang only noticed after a good while. She turned to him, tone accusing, Zhou Shu, what are you doing? Zhou Zishu replied unhurriedly, Little sister Gu, I'm just a frail beggar who has never been attacked by this many before. I'm very afraid. Please protect me. Gu Xiong's hand shook in anger. Her knife plunged into one's chest, to the point that it was deeply lodged in their ribcage and unable to be removed. Gu Xiong was flexible, but not enduring enough in a long fight. She became frantic after having lost her weapon, moving 3 steps back, trying her best to defend herself. Zhou Zishu, after a fair time to rest, didn't rejoin the fight right away. He watched them all with a chuckle, picking up a few small rocks. He played with them before abruptly shot one at the forehead of one, intending to perform a sneak attack on the girl. That's no good at all. Your moves don't have a structure to it. He gave her some directions at the same time. He was as quick as lightning, flicking another stone at one's Huantao point to make them lose balance and stumble forward, conveniently right under Gu Xiong's feet. She instinctively lifted her leg, a reflecting light flashing under her shoe to reveal a tiny blade, which was used to stab the person in the throat. Zhou Zishu continued leisurely, the foundation is of utmost importance. If your phases are without roots and you move without a basis, how can you fully control yourself in a situation? Gu Xiong was a smart one. She bent her back to dodge a sword, kicking at the enemy's leg. Taking advantage of them falling forward to restrain the pulse, she snatched their weapon away afterwards, cracking down on their Beihui point to kill them for good. Another stone was shot at one's Jianjing point while they were in the middle of attacking, making their upper body freeze and fall. Gu Xiong heard the beggar complain equivocally, "No good, still no good, the formation has been broken, but that's not an excuse to take risks, stop underestimating things." At those words, the lotus shape created from her feet movements became more lively and flexible. She dodged another one, who by instinct changed their strategy by holding the sword horizontally, exposing a weak spot that Gu Xiong could exploit. She easily took down 2 more thanks to that. In no times, bodies littered the ground. The rest of the masked people glanced at each other and retreated, knowing this would not go well if they continued. Zhou Zishu frowned. These people were way too troublesome. He did agree to take the boy to this Taihu Holdings or wherever, but he wouldn't tolerate the possible hordes of attackers along the way. If he let them go this time, they would just come back later during the journey. These murderers with ambiguous identity, who tried to eradicate every single person in the boy's family, were the true scums of the earth. A fleeting motion made Gu Xiong dizzy. The person who was just sitting at the table was now at the shrine's door. The masked person nearest to him only had time to slightly lean away before their shoulder was dislodged with a cracking sound. Zhou Zishu had his hand around their throat, twisting it with the gentlest movement. The tip of his toe lifted the victim's fallen weapon at the same time. On his pallid face was a smile that carried all of the world's demonic energy. Gu Xiong couldn't keep up with what was happening, and before she knew it, all that remained of the assassin group had become corpses. She blinked in astonishment. This ragged man's ramblings worth diddly squat, but his execution in battle was one of the cleanest and cruelest she had ever seen. It really made one wonder who he was. Zhou Zishu was actually not holding on as impressively as she thought, his legs like jelly, body not having enough time to recover ever since he touched the ground again. There was a slight sway to him after he had finished all of them, but he had no intention for Gu Xiong to find out, retreating a few steps as his strength allowed. His walk seemed light as feather, but in reality he was in a miserable state, trying his hardest to find something that could support him. A pair of arms suddenly appeared behind out of nowhere, propping him up firmly. Zhou Zishu startled. He couldn't sense this person coming near at all, feeling his hair stand on end. Fortunately, the person purely wanted to help with no further motives. Gu Xiong's eyes shone as she exclaimed, "Master!" Zhou Zishu heaved a sigh of relief at that, straightening. The person behind him was the man in gray he saw back at the tavern, looking around 30, face undeniably handsome, though his stare would unnerve most people. Those intense eyes were fixed on Zhou Zishu right now, full of impudence, looking as if they wanted nothing else than to uncover what was beneath the layer of mask on his face. Zhou Zishu coughed, "Thank you." When Kexing. The man replied, his expressions riddled with vague doubt. He dragged his eyes down to Zhou Zishu's neck and hands, suspicion only piling up further. Even though Zhou Zishu couldn't detect the man's intention, he had confidence in his craft. He knew his skills better than anyone. If he failed this simple disguise, then he would have perished during a mission years ago. "Ah, thank you, Brother Wen," he said calmly. The man tore his gaze away after a good while, nodding, "It's nothing." He strolled into the shrine after that. Gu Xiong was flittering around kicking away the bodies, making a seat for her master from the hay. Wen Kexing glanced at Zhou Zishu once more. "I didn't mean to do it," he added, in case the latter misunderstood what happened. Zhou Zishu instantly recognized where Gu Xiong got her peculiar attitude from. He sat down and began to meditate. After about 2 hours, He opened his eyes to Wen Kexing leaning on a wall, legs crossed, still watching him intently. He couldn't help but ask, "Is there something on my face? Why does brother Wen keep studying me?" Wen Kexing asked with a straight face, "Are you wearing a disguise?" Zhou's issue tensed, his face betraying nothing. "What do you mean?" The other paid it no mind, muttering under his breath, "How strange. Really, really strange. I can't see if you're wearing a mask or not, can't be sure that you aren't. He rubbed his chin, sounding uncertain. "I've never been wrong before. The moment I saw your butterfly bone, I knew you had to be a great beauty." Nothing could have prepared Zhou's issue for that answer. Wen Kexing nodded, confirming to himself. "I'm definitely not wrong this time, of course you're wearing a disguise." Nothing could have prepared Zhou's issue for this answer, either. Wen Kexing didn't stop staring at him, only giving up after a long period. "Though I can't see anything on you that would indicate such." He inclined his head backwards. "How good must you be for me to not see through your tricks? Can someone like you really exist? This is really, really, impossible." Guxiang spoke coldly, "Master, remember last time when you told me a butcher was pretty just by looking at his back?" Wen Kexing's voice softened. He might be a butcher, but those watery, shining eyes of his were enough proof of his charms. People never care about a hero's background, why can't that be applied to a butcher too? But what does an uncultured brat like you know anyway? Guxiang sighed. Watery, shining eyes. He was just teary from yawning. And apart from that, his nose was big, his mouth was big, his head was big, his ears. Wen Kexing's voice left no room for arguments. "Guxiang, you are very blind." Zhou's issue had nothing to do but to go check out Zhang Chengling's well-being. Chapter 7. Setting off. When Zhou's issue made Zhang Chengling pass out, he did it out of fear that the boy would harbor too many bad thoughts. Calming him down was a necessity. There was barely any force to it, so the boy woke up not long after the strange Wen Kexing arrived. He opened his eyes, dazedly staring at the ceiling as if his soul had left the body. Until yesterday he was still the Zhang's young master, pampered by many, even when his tutor told him that he was utterly stupid and useless, even when his martial art teacher was secretly disappointed that he was just bad mud, unable to plaster walls. His life was happy and content. He got people dressing and feeding him. Everywhere he went servants would follow, serving him diligently even with his mediocre studying until late night. They would flatter him all day long, and even when Zhang Chengling knew his worth, it didn't stop him from basking in the false praises sometimes. His life went by with such privilege for 14 years. Then he lost everything in a single night. His home was gone, his parents killed along with all relatives and friends, his world turning upside down. He was terrified, but he didn't know what to do. Zhou's issue was the type who knew how to fart better than to console people, so he stayed at his place silently. There was only a blank stare on Zhang Chengling's face, tears streaming down from his eyes. He heard Wen Kexing asking Guxiang, "Who's this little thing?" He said to be Zhang Yusin's son. Wen Kexing nodded with a dull face, like Zhang Yusin's name to him was no more than a fleck of dust. He spoke again a while after. "I heard that the Zhang family was so poor that they had nothing but money. How did a son of Zhang Yusin end up like this? Did he run off without bringing enough silvers or was he lost?" Guxiang lowered her voice. "From what he told us, someone murdered all the Sangs. The news must have shaken up the whole city by now, but I guess you didn't hear about it while fooling around somewhere." Wen Kexing thought for a bit, nodding. No wonder there were so many corpses. He turned to assess Zhou's issue. "Then what's he doing here?" he asked Guxiang. The girl scoffed. "That beggar called himself Zhou. He sold himself to a dead man for 2 silvers, so now he had to escort the boy to Taihu." Wen Kexing's eyes widened, internally evaluating something with a completely serious face. He told Guxiang afterwards, "Now I'm even more certain that he's a beauty. Only beautiful people can be that dumb." Guxiang resorted to ignorance, too used to her master's antics. Zhou's issue followed suit since he had yet to fully gauge this man's ability. He turned to look at a teary Zhang Chengling, feeling somewhat annoyed and wishing that the younger would stop already. He poked him with the tip of his toes, coughing, "Young Master Zhang, get yourself together if you've done resting. We shouldn't stay at this place for long, there must be more people after you to finish off their job. This Uncle Zhou is entrusted, so the least he will do is taking you to Taihu safe and sound." Zhang Chengling's eyes shifted to look around. The moment they stopped, he covered his face with his hands and curled up into a ball, wailing. Zhou's issue felt a headache coming with the boy's cries. He told himself that a scolding was necessary but didn't have the heart to do it. Comforting children was not his forte either, so silence was the best option. Then suddenly he sat up, walking toward the door. He was just intending to check out the state of the Buddha statue and maybe restore it to the original place, reasoning that his previous action seemed quite offensive and wouldn't help if he wanted to gather more merits. Zhou Zishu didn't expect Zhang Chengling, who at that moment assumed the elder wanted to abandon him, to scramble forward, rushing to grip at his ankles, shouting, Uncle Joe, please don't. Please don't leave me, I. He looked extremely pitiful sobbing like that. Even though they ran into each other by pure chance, the younger had no one else to rely on but Zhou Zishu. The latter was his savior, a living Buddha. Zhou Zishu looked down at him impassively, voice insipid, has your father never told you that a true man has gold under his knees? After moments of being starstruck, thanks to those words Zhang Chengling finally reached some kind of comprehension. He used the sleeves to wipe away the tears and snots with all his might. Paying respect to the sky, the earth, the king, family and teacher is a matter of course. You have saved me, Uncle Joe, will you let me be your disciple? When Kexing and Gu Xiang observed the scene in amusement, the latter whispering, last night he was still a foolish child. He got smart real fast, huh? Zhou Zishu could only reply, stand up first. Zhang Chengling stubbornly refused. I won't stand until you accept. If I can't avenge my family, am I even worth existing? Shifu. Zhou Zishu cared none about his arguments, dragging the younger up by the shoulder. I'm an invalid who's gonna die soon. It's enough of a blessing for me to be able to get by another day, and you think I can teach you anything? I heard that Sir Zhao Jing of Tai, who is your father's old friend, go see him and there will be better people to help you with your vengeance. He concentrated his internal force into the palms, picking up the statue and putting it back on the altar, muttering sinful. He saluted not quite seriously before turning to speak to a still dumbfounded Zhang Chengling. We should leave now that you're fully awake. If you want to avenge your family, we need to get you to Sir Zhao as fast as possible. But now we should get some food first. He stretched without a care, smiling at Gu Xiang and ignoring Wen Kexing. He then left the shrine in a blink of an eye, not bothering to check if Zhang Chengling could catch up. The boy stood in dejection, but hurriedly followed after realizing the man had already gone. Wen Kexing rubbed his chin, watching the two silhouettes with obvious interest. Let's follow them, we're going to Taihu. He stood up and told Gu Xiang. The mischievous look on her face vanished. She replied in a low voice after some thoughts, Master, Zhang Chengling said the Zhang family massacre was done by the ghosts of Guangzhou. Shui Fang the hanged ghost was there. Wen Kexing glanced at her with no expressions. So? Gu Xiang startled a little, chasing after the already leaving Wen Kexing, asking him with a serious voice, the hanged ghost was clearly fake since I beat them yesterday. Master! Did you know something already? Xiang. Wen Kexing stared at her again, his eyes seemingly black holes that could suck people in. Gu Xiang quieted down immediately, mumbling, I know, I talked too much. At that moment, her face looked pale, as if this ever-fearless girl was dreading something. Wen Kexing's fixed gaze only turned away in approval after the reply as he continued forward. Gu Xiang followed him, keeping a small distance. She heard Wen Kexing, we're gonna follow that Zhou person. My instincts were never wrong, he can't be anything else but beautiful. We will catch him red-handed eventually. Xiang, let's make a bet since you don't believe me. Because of this, Zhou Zishu definitely didn't have a peaceful journey. Escorting Zhang Chengling was no different than carrying the biggest fart as there were endless flies along the way. He just knocked out another one tonight, regretting his decisions while looking at the two silvers. He still had half of his strength and his skills didn't go anywhere, so those people should know better than to touch him. But the nails made things unpredictable, resulting in his annoyance at the endless torture from both the pain and the flock of scums attacking it every minute, not to mention the pair of master and maid who kept trailing behind them for no reasons. He could throw them off the track with ease had he not been accompanied a small burden. In addition, the mysterious Wen Kexing had some talent to him. There were many times Zhou Zishu managed to leave him behind only to end up seeing the terribly punch-inviting face just half a day later. Zhou Zishu quietly dragged another assassin's body outside before returning to their room to meditate. Zhang Chengling noticed nothing, still deeply asleep with his nonsensical dreams. During the past days they were traveling together, he found out that this boy didn't display any stuck-up behaviors. The wailing child of before seemed to have disappeared completely, like he was forced into maturity. He didn't complain even when they going at a very slow pace, obeying Zhou Zishu's every word, being generally very honest and sincere. His only shortcoming was the inability to stop calling the elder Shifu, no matter how much he had been corrected. Zhou Zishu eventually gave up, believing that after dropping the boy off in Taihu for the Zayas, he would leave immediately to travel to anywhere he wanted. He had it all planned out already. After seeing the famous mountains and lakes, he would go south rather than north, as there was a friend in Nanjing to whom he hadn't paid a visit. He had to at least see them and have a drink together before descending to the underworld. Suddenly, the young man on the bed tossed and turned violently, drenched in sweat. He was like that almost every night. During the day he was calm on the outside with thoughts of vengeance and regaining mental stability, but memories of that fated night had become nightmares, not letting him go. Zhou Zishu sighed, shaking him awake. Zhang Chengling let out a cry and sat up, eyes blank. He only reacted after a good time had passed, murmuring at Zhou Zishu, "Uncle Zhou. I didn't mean to do that." He was so young and inexperienced that even his bloodshot eyes retained an innocence that was way too familiar. Zhou Zishu was instantly reminded of someone he knew in the past. The one whose only wish was to wander everywhere in Zhonghu with him. He couldn't help but sit there in a daze. Zhang Chengling spoke cautiously. "Uncle Zhou, I didn't mean to wake you up, I just dreamt of my father." His lips quivered, pale. I can stop sleeping if it's a problem?" Zhou Zishu patted his shoulder, voice unintentionally tender, "It's alright, sleep all you want. I'll wake you if there's a nightmare." Zhang Chengling made a noise in reply, crawling back under his blanket, fingers still unconsciously holding onto Zhou Zishu's sleeve. The man stared down at it meaningfully. There was awkwardness in Zhang Chengling's smile when he retracted his hand. At that moment, from a place seemingly not far away, there was someone making a twang sound with the strings of their zither. Zhang Chengling felt that sound as if feeling a lightning snapped right next to his ears. Even his organs seemed to tremble. Pain started afterwards, and he cried out loud, clutching at his chest desperately. Chapter 8. Moonshade. The sound made by the zither was incredibly thin, like a binding spider web coming from every direction, carrying deadly treacherous intentions. Gu Xiang also felt the insides of her body churning at the sound, but she was quick to assess the situation, immediately forcing herself to calm down. Wen Kexing, who was just sleeping on the bed moments before, had already woken, standing by the window silently. Moonlight veiled over his face, softening his features. His eyes didn't blink, staring pointedly at somewhere in the dark. His shadow stretched long behind him. He remained unmoved, expressions flitting between blankness and mirth, creating the image of a detached but mystifying stone statue. Under the cover of the night, his dangerous aura was set free without restraint. He looked like a ghost empty of human emotions. Gu Xiang was smart enough to cover her ears the moment she sensed something abnormal, trying her best to block the sound coming from outside. She sat up straight, finally getting rid of the nausea after minutes of meditation. Wen Kexing's slender fingers brushed over the window bars, letting out a low laugh. They even recruited enchanted Songchen song. This would definitely cost a fortune. Makes one question who they want to deal with. In a flash, he heard something dashing through the air. The sound was thick, barely recognizable, like it came from the strings of an old and unused instrument. There was also another person flinging tiny rocks into the endless night sky. There was almost no sound to the flying objects, but those elusive rocks managed to cut off the never-ending zither's song in such a subtle way, not unlike how one threw a stone into the water, instantly creating ripples that spread to places no one could see or catch. As expected, the song halted. Wen Kexing leaned on the window to listen attentively, his eyes closed. The corner of his lips lifted into a smile. The zither resounded again all of a sudden, the strength carried in the song rivaling floods and giant beasts. Its user seemed to have resorted to the killing move. Practically at the same time, an ear-piercing noise was unleashed from the room next door. It seemed to come from a flute, but normally flutes would never make sounds that sharp, so sharp to the point it felt like they could tear something apart. A battle broke out between the intense flute and the demonic zither with implausible reflex from both sides. The zither strings split in a blink of an eye. The world was plunged into silence afterwards. Wen Kexing still stood where he was, shaking his head and mumbling, "Our predecessors have never been wrong, it's inevitable for a swordsman to die by a sword." Gu Xiang let out an exhale after everything had passed, wiping the cold sweat on her forehead. "Say, Master, is that Tian? Tian something dead?" Wen Kexing's voice was gentle. "Even if he's still alive, all of his meridians have been broken, he's useless now. Death would be a happier fate for him." He suddenly pushed open the window, speaking to Gu Xiang with an even lower voice than before, as if not wanting to disturb something. "Listen, Ah Xiang, life will always be fascinating. If you want something, be prepared to pay for its price. Using his zither to kill people is surely fun, but you have to watch out for the ones that can bite back. Gu Xiong tilted her head. When will they bite back? When Kexing was patient. When they're stronger than you. The girl nodded, asking again after mulling the thought over, why do you have to compete with someone stronger when you can just pick on weaker ones instead? He turned his head to look at her. Being backlit by the moon, the man's whole body seemed to bathe in silver light, his expressions getting harder and harder to read. After a good while, he replied, or you can pick on no one and be a good person like me. One good person. Kexing then left through the window, leaving a speechless Gu Xiong behind staring after him. Zhou Zishu's situation was not exactly ideal either. He made this flute during the journey out of boredom with very poor craftsmanship. The notes were not right, the tuning all over the place, so he never got around to using it. He didn't expect it to be useful tonight. A big crack appeared after a single use. It was fortunate for him to have been able to manipulate the opponent into giving it their all, because only then did he succeed in delivering the killing blow. The results would have been very different otherwise. Zhang Chengling looked like he had just been fished out of the water. Since the boy wasn't competent enough, even though Zhou Zishu had helped cover his ears, the zither's sound still left him with internal injuries. His face was as blanched as paper after throwing up. Zhou Zishu was worried that he was too young and weak to meditate on his own, so he put his palms on the younger's back, lowering his voice, concentrate. Then he used his inner force to assist the boy, only retracted after his complexion looked a little better. His own body was drenched in sweat. It was a blessing that they were very close to Taihu now, he mused, or else he would feel incredibly humiliated for almost not carrying out the mission that he had promised to do. Having never done any good deeds for a large portion of his life, he couldn't fail the very first one. That would probably cause bad luck. In Zhonghu, there was next to no one who possessed as much information as him, Tian Chuang's former leader. He knew exactly who the person he fought was the moment they went head to head. Legends had it that enchanted Song Qin Song was a eunuch who loved to dress as a woman. The colorful clothes he wore forewarned people of his poisonous nature. Thanks to the fact that he could murder people without a trace, he was very valued. His principle was that the more he was paid, the more loyal he would be to that person. Since silence had fallen, Zhou Zishu surmised that he was either dead or very close to it. Had he been as powerful as before, he would have finished the other off, but now only half his life was left, so there was no certainty of success. Besides, that might be too cruel. He then heard the sound of clapping outside and someone praising, how emotionally provoking this nighttime melody has been. How would anyone not miss their hometown after listening to it? Brother Zhou has blended the sound of flute and zither beautifully under the moon and stars tonight. This talent, this elegance must belong to a beauty only. He had never seen anyone talking this much rubbish. Zhou Zishu thought about how he didn't notice the other standing outside the window at all. Someone this unpredictable would be hard to deal with even when he was at his best. He could only think of 3 people and a half who possessed such power. It would be foolish to ever offend any of them. He inhaled, opening the window, pointing at his sickly face with the deadly pale skin and dull eyes. This beauty? He asked. When Kexing choked, glancing at the visage which was not too unpleasant but not something people would want to look at twice, either. He turned to watch the moon after that. Zhou Zishu lifted his legs to sit on the windowsill, following the other's gaze. The full moon was especially bright tonight, the moonlight was cold like water and the ground looked like it's covered in mist. Zhou Zishu wondered who Wen Kexing was among those dangerous 3 people and a half. On the other hand, he was also unsure about the man's motives for following him. The confusion only grew the more he thought about it. He felt a particular aura from this man that suggested they might be birds of a feather. The other would definitely not do something if it didn't benefit him. He was following another man. Or, he actually was following Zhang Chengling to Taihu. There must be some kind of plan behind this. After lots of thoughts without any solid conclusions, he scoffed at himself. Old habits died hard. He looked down to Wen Kexing studying him enthusiastically, smiling. If brother Wen is really curious, how about making me shed my skin to see the flesh inside? Wen Kexing raised his brows. Fine by me. His hands were at Zhou Zishu's face barely after the word fine was uttered. But the latter was prepared, leaning backwards, one leg raised to kick at Wen Kexing's wrists. In just seconds, there were so many moves traded back and forth they would make any onlookers dizzy. Zhou Zishu felt like he was at a disadvantage since his position on the windowsill limited lots of movements. He ducked down to dodge another move, jumping down. However, the night was not a good time for him, and in addition to the previous torment, a nail caused intense pain at that moment, making him slow down. When Kexing's palm was close to his torso out of nowhere, But the man suddenly stopped before he was hit with his strength. Zhou Zishu looked down to glimpse at the palm that was almost touching his chest, his expression calm as ever. He smiled, "Thank you brother Wen for having mercy on me." He was interrupted by that very palm reaching up to touch his face. Wen Kexing didn't stop there as he slowly caressed with his fingers, seemingly wanting to determine if it was really human skin. Zhou Zishu didn't get to step back before Gu Xiang, having heard the noises, looked down from the window and pulled her head back inside almost immediately, exclaiming, "Oh my, how rude of me." Correct, exactly what he was also thinking. Wen Kexing stood very close to him with a serious face. The seriousness turned ambiguous under the moonlight, giving one the impression that he was actually being rude. Gu Xiang didn't bother to be quiet. "Oh man, I'm going blind. Zhou Zishu quickly coughed, stepped a long step away, calming himself down. He found this situation both hilarious and embarrassing. "Did brother Wen see what my face is made of yet?" "Human skin," Wen Kexing replied after moments of pensiveness. Zhou Zishu seemed to agree without thinking. Wen Kexing stared at his hands. "Strange." "How strange? It feels like it's become one with your body." Zhou Zishu replied unperturbedly, "It's a shame to admit this, but I'm actually born with it." Were there another person observing, excluding Gu Xiang, of course, they would definitely came to the conclusion that one of these two men was a lunatic. Wen Kexing felt a bit out of his depth, looking at Zhou Zishu one last time before leaving, not to his room but somewhere outside. Gu Xiang stuck her head out again, rolling her eyes while beaming. Master must be unable to accept reality at the moment, bet he's gonna visit his pretty friend at Gu Lan Bordello. It's good that he's gone, everyone can prepare for sleep now." There was a considerable distance between them and Wen Kexing, but without looking back, his voice was still delivered to Gu Xiang directly and clearly through the air. He said, "What did you just say, Xiang?" Gu Xiang gave in, "Just breaking wind." Then she quickly went back inside, as if wanting to keep the reply to herself. Only then did Zhou Zishu exhale, releasing the tension from his body. Grating his teeth, he leaned onto the wall without making any sounds. It was fortunate that his pain came in phases and bursts. He waited until feeling a little better to pull himself together before getting back inside. Tonight seemed to be longer than usual. 3 days later, Zhou Zishu, and a Zhang Chengling who became surprisingly thinner after just a few days, reached Taihu. He knocked on the door, but before he got to explain anything, the butler stared at Zhang Chengling, crying out, Are you Chengling? Are you really Chengling?" Then he turned his head to yell at the servants, "Go inform sir, quickly, young Master Chengling is here. Young Master Chengling is still alive." A short time passed by until Sir Zhao Jing of Taihu was at the door to greet them himself. Zhang Chengling fell onto his knees. It seemed like the news had spread everywhere. They stood there crying together before making a fanfare out of escorting them inside. Finally his ancestors would no longer be haunted, Zhou Zishu mused. Being a good person was really exhausting. Chapter 9. In the Woods. Zhao Jing of Taihu, also referred to as the Swordsman of Qiushan, was once a renowned figure. Before they got to Taihu, Zhou Zishu had been looking forward to meeting this elusive hero whose name preceded his appearance. The anticipation grew when he caught wind of the news that Yu Jianji, the only son of Hua Shan Sect's patriarch, along with Mu Yunj, lord of Duanjian Mountain Manor and Sir One-Eye Jiangche would also be at the same place. Zhou Zishu knew their status and background like the back of his hand. To avoid offense, Tian Chuang had a separate archive of every single event and figure in Zhonghu in the last 50 years. For example, Zhou Zishu knew that Zhao Jing the heroic Qiushan swordsman was once exiled from his family and spent his days in sufferings. For money, he had committed crimes not unlike what enchanted Song Qin Song had done. He only started using his real name Zhao Jing again at 27, marrying the only daughter of the Feng family that owned Taihu, using nepotism to build wealth. He also secretly killed off the ones who knew of his past, and was reaccepted into the Zhao family after the marriage. Another example would be the famous young Sir Yu Tianji. It was said that he once had a tryst with a maiden from Yimei sect but betrayed her afterwards, resulting in the girl committing suicide with their unborn child of 3 months old. Of course, she was honorable enough to never reveal the wretched lover's name. Zhou Zishu was deeply interested in them since he knew all too well the kind of people they all were. Besides, he was weak to Zhang Chengling's pleadings, so he agreed to stay at the Zayas for one more night. Despite his past, Zhao Jing did have a gallant aura to him. He didn't look down on the ragged Zhou Zishu who couldn't even walk properly. But he was also experienced, and through Zhang Chengling's stories of the dangers he had to face on the journey, he became suspicious of this beggar-looking man's background. That day, after helping the two settle down, have a proper shower and food, Zhao Jing called Zhang Chengling to the study to tell him what had happened in the past days. Zhang Chengling, after all, was still a child. It was hard enough for him to find someone he could call family, so he told the elder everything, even stuffs that he had yet to understand. Zhao Jing listened to him in terror, and after contemplation he couldn't help but ask, "This Joe gentleman, do you know who he really is?" Zhang Chengling told him what happened at the abandoned shrine without hesitation. Zhao Jing narrowed his eyes and stroked his beard. He comforted the younger briefly before sending him to bed. From the 10 days of traveling together, Zhou Zishu had come to know this Zhang Chengling child. Despite lacking a lot due to being pampered from a young age, he was a good kid with a good heart, never complaining when facing hardship, to the point of being a little simple-minded. Since Zhao Jing wanted to talk to him, Zhou Zishu was sure that the sly old fox must have succeeded in tricking Zhang Chengling into revealing information about him without meaning to. He laughed internally. It didn't really matter whether he was Zhou Shu or Zhou Zishu, as both names were shrouded in mystery anyway. Even someone with vast knowledge and ample resources would know no further about Tian Chuang other than the general information about the organization itself, much less its leader. Even if one investigated into Lord Zhou, they would only dig up a nominal general whose responsibility was managing the inner court's royal guards, who was worth currying favor with but not important enough to be looked at twice. Sure enough, from the early morning of the next day, Zhou Zishu became the newest hot topic among residents in Taihu Holdings. It was impossible to leave the guest room thanks to the never-ending stream of visitors. He had no choice but to greet and see them off one by one. "Ah, Sir Zhao, truly an honor to finally meet you. Seeing is truly believing, your appearance brought such a prosperous aura. You're asking who taught this lowly one? Oh, we're just nobodies, not worth being mentioned at all. Ah, Sir Tian, truly an honor to finally meet you. Seeing is truly believing, your appearance brought such a prosperous aura. Where I'm from? This one is just a lowly beggar, it's not worth mentioning. No, I'm not from the beggar sect, how can I ever be deserving of joining them? I'm just a nobody, really. Ah, Sir Sun, truly an honor to finally meet you. Seeing is truly believing, your appearance brought such a prosperous aura. I'm just a nobody, it wouldn't be out of the ordinary at all that you've never heard of me. Ah, Sir Li, truly an honor to finally meet you. Seeing is truly believing, your appearance brought such a prosperous aura. No, I've never known that other Sir Li that well, what we had was just a convenient assistance during hard times. Which sect? I'm from none, just a nobody, not worth mentioning at all. As the night drew near, Zhou Zishu had been smiling so much his entire face was stiffened. It took a lot of massaging for it to return to the natural state. He knew deeply in his soul that complete paralysis wouldn't be far away if he had to suffer one more day of this, so he immediately planned to leave. Considering the insistence and the inquiries about other people's business, these Zhonghu heroes were no better than nosy gossipers at markets. It was as if they wished they could have just stick their head into others' house and use their eagle eyes to scan over anything and everything, seeing under the skin to determine if this was a human or a ghost. If one said they were from one of the 8 big sects and was a disciple of this blah 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 person, the other one could reply that, oh, truly an honor to finally meet you, my Shishu and your master knew each other way back. Otherwise, they would be considered an outsider, and their character needed more time to be judged. It was nighttime. Under the waning moon, Zhou Zishu opened his eyes. He had been sleeping early since now was the time for the nails to cause troubles. But the pain was nothing too serious, he just needed rest. He stood up, hesitating a little. It was admittedly rude to leave without saying goodbye. He left behind 2 letters, one for Zhang Chengling, saying mountains are still green, waters will still flow long and far. An incredible satisfaction washed over him after writing the note, as he felt like he had finally embodied being a Zhonghu wanderer now. The other letter was for Zhao Jing with one mere sentence, ever grateful for the welcoming stay. He placed them under the teapot before gracefully jumping onto the roof. On the roof was a small dragon-lee cat strolling. It felt a fleeting shadow and halted in alert, eyes wide, but didn't see anything else. Tilting its head in confusion, the cat ran towards the kitchen. Zhou Zishu left the Zayas without a sound. He was sure that no one had noticed, so never would he have imagined that there was someone seemingly having predicted his moves and was already waiting for him in a small forest only a mile away from the holdings. Zhou Zishu felt annoyance creeping up the moment he glanced at that person. He saw Wen Kexing saluting him smilingly. Ah, how coincidental, Brother Zhou. Seems like we are fated after all, only soulmates would keep crossing paths under the moonlight like this. Zhou Zishu smiled back, Truly coincidental, isn't it, Brother Wen? Coincidental my ass, you pestilence, he thought. He tilted his head, asking after not seeing Gu Xiang, young Miss Gu's not here? Wen Kexing gave a straightforward answer, that little girl is an inconvenience, she walks too slow. She'll only be in the way while I'm looking for this important, elusive figure that is. You. The smile freezed on Zhou Zishu's face. He stared at Wen Kexing, then spoke after a good while, if this useless one was an important figure, then what would become of Monk Gu of Mount Changming, the Poison King of the Southern Seas Guanyin Palace, or the Ghost Lord of Quanju Ridge? Wen Kexing stared back meaningfully. Monk Gu cares none for the mortals, all he seeks is the path of cultivation. The Poison King is said to have blended into the vast world of Zhonghu. It'd be a hard feat to find him. And the Ghost Lord is no less ambiguous. Never have I got the chance to meet this one. As for whether he's human or not, it's a story for another day. They looked at each other after that, smiles carrying malicious intentions. Zhou Zishu was the first to turn his eyes away. Zhou Mo is merely a passerby. Why is it that everyone have their eyes on me? Wen Kexing replied with a manner not unlike when one reunited with an old friend during a spring hiking. Then why doesn't Brother Zhou stay with the Zayas for a while longer? Taihu is popular for its pretty scenery. Why must you leave this soon without looking around a bit? This useless one has already experienced Taihu's incredible view. Staying will only create unnecessary inconveniences for Sir Zhao. Not to mention we don't know each other that well. I did the favor for 2 silvers, it's not worth risking my life for them. Zhou Zishu paused before adding, escorting the young Master Zhang is purely for gathering merits, so that I won't have to endure any tortures in the underworld after death. That's all to it. Gathering merits. Wen Kexing repeated in agreement somewhat, head nodding, correct, Brother Zhou truly shares the same mind with me, and as only beautiful people can do that, it is clear? Zhou Zishu's temples throbbed at it is clear. He was about to interrupt when suddenly, a piercing scream was heard deep inside the forest behind Wen Kexing. They both temporarily stopped. Wen Kexing pointed to the direction of the scream, see, my dear soulmate, another chance for merit gathering has appeared. Zhou Zishu showed hesitation, but eventually decided to go towards the direction of the sound, grudgingly replying to the other at the same time, our problems are very serious, Brother Wen, you should look for a physician soon. Wen Kexing followed close behind. Zhou Zishu's Guangdong had reached the stage where he could travel without leaving any traces, but the other man was able to keep up with him without fail, always keeping a small distance. Normally, one would stay silent during the traveling, so as not to lose their vital energy, but Wen Kexing didn't seem to mind it. Brother Zhou is very correct, I do have to see some famous physicians whenever I have the chance to get treated properly. Up until now I'm still unable to find any mistakes in Brother Zhou's disguise. What awful eyesight I have, and I'm not even that old yet, how shameful, shameful. Zhou Zishu really wanted to get rid of those eyes that were supposedly getting worse every day, but on second thought, he didn't know enough about this man, and with the intellect and self-restraint of a former Tian Chuang's leader, he would not do something foolish like that. With an incredible speed, soon enough they reached the deeper part of the forest. There they saw a corpse. The person died a ghastly death, dressed in black clothes, their mask fallen to both sides, revealing wide open eyes. Zhou Zishu felt a sense of familiarity before he even got to see the body clearly, so he bent down to inspect further. He couldn't help but frown afterwards, isn't this Sir Mu, Lord of Duanjian Mountain Manor? Just this morning he was rambling to no ends for an hour. No one could have thought that he also became a night owl like Zhou Zishu, then a dead owl, unfortunately. Wen Kexing approached as well, rubbing his chin with interest, moonlit night, black clothes, it's possible that. Zhou Zishu turned to the other, ready to hear his deductions. Only for Wen Kexing to continue his brilliant train of thought, that Lord Mu is out here picking flowers? Zhou Zishu turned away, face expressionless, internally praising himself for keeping his composure. There was no trace of blood on Mu Yunja's body or beside him, but his lips had gotten bluer. Zhou Zishu, after some thought, opened the front of his shirt. On his chest was only a black mark in the shape of a hand. Chapter 10. Netherworld. Zhou Zishu stared at the handprint for a while, then turned the corpse front down, undressing the body's upper half. Another handprint was on his back at the same position. Wen Kexing sighed, was he branded, or the attack went through his body? Zhou Zishu replied nonchalantly. No one would waste their time to play with the dead, the attack went through from one side of his body to the other. I can only think of one person in the recent 50 years who is able to do this. It's the Raksha Palms from Sun Ding, the delighted morning ghost, Wen Kexing continued. Zhou Zishu glanced at him without replying, kneeling down to search Mu Yunja's body carefully. What he found were some banknotes and silvers. Oh, stealthily left the Zhao's holdings at late night while carrying travel expenses. Zhou Zishu touched his own chest, so did he. Brother Wen, this night owl isn't out here to pick flowers, a sex offender doesn't need this much cash with him. Probably doesn't need extra clothes for bathing, either. Wen Kexing kicked a small bag hidden in a bush into the open. The bag was also made of black cloth, and inside was some clothes for changing when one was away from home. The forest earth was damp and soft with a chaotic map of footprints on it, but there didn't seem to be evidence of a fight. Beside the mark of the hand which caused instant death, there weren't any other wounds or scars on Mu Yunja's body. His famous sword was by his hip, still sheathed. Mu Yunja's kung fu was definitely above average, at least he would not fight back like a suckling. Zhou Zishu fell into silence, thinking perhaps the dignified and righteous swordsman of Duanjian Manor and the delighted morning ghost of the valley had arranged a date. A bloody one at that, which likely started out as a passionate but the passion turned into anger afterwards. There seemed to be 3 people present before they arrived, and while Mu Yunja's footprints stopped here, the other 2's went in different directions, suggesting they might not be on the same side. One was no doubt chasing after Mu Yunja to this place, then sat down to examine the body just like what Zhou Zishu was doing right now. Zhou Zishu squatted on the ground, the old habit of questioning everything rearing its head again, making his insides itch. He felt an urge to follow the footprints, but rationality warned him that it would only lead to troubles. He was no longer the all-knowing mighty leader of Tian, there was no point in burdening himself with inconveniences. Wen Kexing watched his companion sit in a terribly indecent fashion and looked like it would take him forever to stand up. After a long while he couldn't help but ask, "You won't pursue them?" Zhou Zishu stared at him, still waging an internal war. Wen Kexing, after some thought, strode after the second one's footprints, saying, "Then I will." Zhou Zishu followed him unconsciously, speaking in surprise, "You really want to be involved in something that's not your business?" Wen Kexing's face was serious. "Someone killed the Lord of Duanjian Manor, and I'm a charitable person who wants to gather merits, so why not? And I'm bored anyway." Zhou Zishu felt like the last sentence was incredibly reasonable, so he nodded, inquiring again, "Then why don't you follow the first person? Their footprints are very light, so they seem to be the strongest among the 3. Hypothetically speaking, if the third one was the last to come here and was from the Zhao's holding, then the first person is definitely Sun Ding the delighted morning ghost." Wen Kexing completely deadpanned, "You can chase after him if you want, I might be a nosy charitable person, but I also value my life." Zhou Zishu was made speechless by the other's honesty. He followed Wen Kexing closely, looking at the ground under them at a random point and noticing, Wen Kexing didn't even leave any footprints. Someone who could travel without leaving a trace really just said that he was afraid of a ghost, afraid of death. Zhou Zishu, who used to manage and investigate all kinds of matter in the palace, decided to follow his desire to see this case through. Since he was already near death, he would do whatever he wanted, there was nothing in this world of which he should be afraid anymore. The 2 skilled and fearless men sprinted across the forest like shuttles. They found who they were looking for by the river bank, Yu Tianji of Huashan. He was strung up on a tree with silver threads that looked like a spider web, had almost fallen off his shoulder, only barely intact in the gentle blowing wind. A drop of blood fell on the ground, which prompted Wen Kexing to step back to avoid being stained. Then he nudged Yu Tianji's head, completely severing it from the body. The former part was still hung up by the threads, the latter part dropped to the ground with a thud. Wen Kexing touched the body all over, mouth pursed, "Still warm, he died not long ago." Spider silk. Zhou Zishu looked up to Yu Tianji's head, pausing shortly. "It's the hang ghost spider silk." Tai Hu was truly destined for an exciting time to come. Suddenly, Zhou Zishu's ears caught onto something. He shouted, "Who's there?" Behind the tree, a shadow appeared and flew away, looking like a giant bat and disappearing almost instantly. Without hesitation, Zhou Zishu went after it. Wen Kexing still stood there, mumbling, "I'm scared of dying, scared of dying. That's why I can't stay here alone." Then he followed suit. Zhou Zishu took a pine cone, fingers crooked and aiming at the person in black's middle back, but since he always lacked strength after midnight, and coupled with the fact that he had been running for a long time, even though he hit the target, it only made them stumble forward a little and not falling as expected. They didn't even look back, only running faster. Zhou Zishu had doubts about whether this was the real Shui Fang the hanged ghost. Evidently he would not be able to stand against this man, but if he was really one of Quanju Ridge's 10 great ghosts, would he run after seeing a nobody like him? Zhou Zishu thought in astonishment, I'm not a magic mirror either. They got out of the forest in a relatively short time. Behind the forest was a cemetery that spread wide and far, with will-o-wisps flickering all over the place. Seemed like the hanged ghost had reached his territory, as his silhouette became more mystical. Zhou Zishu was not sure if his mind was playing tricks on him, but he felt like he heard someone cackling. The laugh was right next to his ears for a second, then far away the other, making his hair stand on end. Then the hanged ghost disappeared into thin air among the will-o-wisps. Zhou Zishu abruptly stopped walking. Wen Kexing stood beside him, the greenish light casted onto his handsome face, giving him a slightly more demonic look. Some kind of animal let out a howl from far away, and a rat crawled out from underground, staring at the two without fear. It might have devoured the flesh of the dead, since its tiny eyes were pure red. The hanged ghost disappeared under an old locust tree with an owl perched on its branch. The animal tilted its head at the two uninvited guests. Zhou Zishu and Wen Kexing checked around the tree but found no more clues. Zhou Zishu frowned, we've really met a ghost. Then he heard a creepy laugh, turning to Wen Kexing with goose flesh prickling his skin. His companion pointed at the owl. Turned out the sound was from this ghostly animal. The owl and Zhou Zishu had a decently long staring contest before the former spread its wings and flew away without warning. Wen Kexing said, there's this thing I heard when I was little, that owls are only scary when they laugh because there will be death whenever they do. Are you afraid? Zhou Zishu was examining the tombstone under the tree, which didn't have any writings on it. He replied with indifference, there are already two bodies. It was likely that Wen Kexing felt particularly in the mood, so he ignored the answer, continuing with enthusiasm. I also heard that one day at this small village there was a person carrying a bowl with red water inside. An owl knocked the bowl over, and that year 20 people lost their lives. Zhou Zishu raised his head to look at him. Wen Kexing lowered his voice on purpose, it's true. Why did that villager carry a bowl with red water? Zhou Zishu asked in confusion. Wen Kexing choked on his words, turning away to cough. A faint smile appeared on Zhou Zishu's face. All of a sudden, he put his hands on the tombstone, and with just a bit of strength applied, it moved. He tried harder to push it to one side, and with a squashing sound, an entrance was revealed, leading into a dark space with unknown depth. Wen Kexing hurried to take a closer look, going round and round in front of the cave's entrance, tongue clicking. It's rumored that the point of connection between yin and yang carries a lot of yin energy, so there must be a dead locust tree next to it. Do you know that it's called the yin tree, or the ghost tree? Zhou Zishu had his arms crossed, face expressionless at the other's ghost stories. Wen Kexing's descriptions were vivid. Under the old locust there will be an unknown tombstone, and under them is the path to the underworld and legends. During the full moon of the 7th month, wandering souls will crawl out from the nether to return to the mortal realm. The path to the yellow spring is incredibly cold, and at the end you'll see the gates of hell. Once going past that, you'll no longer see the living. There are equinox flowers growing along the way, and then you'll reach the bridge of helplessness. Hey! Zhou Zishu already jumped down. Wen Kexing stared dumbfoundedly at the other's silhouette disappearing behind the entrance before jumping himself. He landed steadily, finding out that the earth was very firm. He looked up to see Zhou Zishu's fleeting smile and the other asking, is brother Wen also interested in seeing the path to the underworld? Wen Kexing nodded, entirely serious. So that the next time I tell my tales, I can officially add that they're true stories. Zhou Zishu shook his head, still smiling. All of a sudden, Wen Kexing silenced them with a gesture, listening attentively with a frown. Can you hear it? What's that sound? His voice lowered. Zhou Zishu tried to distinguish it carefully, his answer indecisive. Is it water? In split seconds, Wen Kexing lit up, taking the lead without forgetting to keep his voice down, so the legends are true indeed. In front of them was a long narrow path, so cramped that two men couldn't walk side by side, only when they had to shrink their shoulders and crouch down was it somewhat manageable. Zhou Zishu did not enjoy this posture at all, thinking that maybe this path was not the official, but one reserved only to women and children. It was unclear how far in they had gone. Dirt fell on both of them, but the end was bright and vast. It led to a large cave, with a small river flowing across with unknown origin and destination. There seemed to be wind inside this cave, but it was also unclear where it came from. The dreary chill came at them from every directions. Even when Kexing shut his mouth at that moment, no longer rambling about how the path to the yellow spring is incredibly cold.